Yesterday I stood with party colleagues and other members of the Oireachtas at the Dáil Gates for a minute's silence in the memory of the men and women and children who have died at the hands of their partner or ex-partner since 1996. This was a very poignant event coming on the International Day opposing violence against women. A shocking 78 women and 10 children have been murdered in these 18 years. The event was organised by Women's Aid, who had laid out shoes along a blank sheet to mark a timeline of these needless and tragic deaths. Shoes, flat heels and sandals standing in silent memoriam of the lives stolen. More than half of all solved murders of women are carried out by a current partner or former partner. These lives, as the vigil so moving stated, are stolen lives. They are stolen from their families, their friends, their communities, snuffed out by an abuser who should have been stopped. A life stolen too often because leaving was never an option. 1 in 5 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. This ranges from physical, emotional, sexual to financial abuse, from abuse, threats to kill, controlling behaviour to stalking and harassment. By their very nature, these are mostly crimes which go on behind closed doors, when the curtains are drawn, when the world around stops looking. But it also happens right out in the open. We must strive to improve public awareness of the risk factors of domestic violence and to encourage everyone to make their homes, their community, their circle of friends a place where this kind of abuse will never be accepted. Because unfortunately we have a culture today which subtly every day teaches young men to do many of the things which can lead to domestic violence. This trend in our society is called the rape culture. Its name is shocking, and some dismiss this idea as over the top. But the symptoms are undeniable, and its effects illustrated by those 78 empty women's shoes are too horrific to ignore. Rape culture is the tendency in modern culture to dehumanise, devalue and commodify women. It has always been there, but has become much more obvious in the modern era with the partial successes of the early feminist movements and the 24-hour consumer capitalist culture, which has sprung up alongside the internet. Technology is not to blame, but it is often the medium through which this culture finds its most vile expression. This tendency creates a culture which normalises the idea that women's bodies are not wholly their own. It encourages blaming rape victims instead of rapists. It jokes about men who beat their partners, and it belittles, demonises and threatens all those who challenge it. This is the culture our young men are growing up in, and whether they are propagators of this culture or simply bystanders, they are affected. This is not good news for those of us who seek to end domestic violence. We have the emergence now of what is called street harassment. Many men will not know what this is, though many engage in it themselves or laugh off the harassment by a friend. Women in Dublin in particular are now plagued often on the street. The harassment ranges from behaviour which can seem innocuous in isolation to full-blown graphic sexual commentary to physical violation, such by strange men on the street. If you search the hashtag everyday sexism, you will find the most depressing barrage of mostly young women sharing their experience of being sexually harassed as they go to work, socialise or even spend time with their children. Some of these people sharing these stories are only teenagers, not old enough to drink, but being sexually harassed daily on the street. A Dublin group has been set up to tell the story of street harassment in the city. It makes for very scary reading. This not to do with what the women wears or how she behaves or looks, but simply that she is a woman and so seen as prey. Women are extremely vulnerable in a society which treats them in this way. Harassment is just the beginning, but it is a major risk factor. If you believe you are entitled to do what you want, top the women on the streets, what will you do with the woman behind closed door? The state also has a hand in teaching young men that violence against women is in some way acceptable or at least forgivable. It seems like every week there is a new case of a woman who has been the victim of sexual assault, who has watched her abuser go free because a judge felt sympathetic to the criminal. These judges have handed down fines for what must be one of the most damaging and reprehensible crimes a person can commit. This is a slap in the face to the brave people who sought to have their attacker prosecuted. But it also says to women and girls who are victims of sexual violence, don't bother. The state will not punish your attacker, but you will be put through the mill anyway. The truth is that 78 is the absolute minimum number of women who could be said to have been murdered by their partners or their ex-partners. These are just the cases which have been solved. We do know that in 2013, Women's Aid received 19,694 calls disclosing abuse to their direct services and 17,254 calls to their free phone line. Those are just the people who could call. As with many of our worst social issues, there are many whose voices are not heard. This is why we have brought the bill. It's to try to help make it easier for people who flee this kind of abuse. It is crucial that we promote opposition to this kind of behaviour. It is essential that we encourage society to challenge the risk factors which lead to domestic violence. But it is also essential that people who seek to leave, to get out, can do so, can be supported, validated and protected. That is what we seek to do, something towards in this bill. And I think the fact that we are discussing this in this particular week is very important in all of the aforementioned aims. Our problem also exists in that funding and support groups like Women's Aid, Safe Ireland and Women's Refuge across the state have been cut either directly or through local authorities. They have a massive task. Ireland was named in the 2012 European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights Research as having the highest rate of all countries in Europe for not meeting women's needs when they sought assistance after the most serious incidents of violence by a partner. These figures have hardly improved over the last 2 years of cuts. These organisations do fantastic work in highlighting domestic violence, sexual abuse and abuse within relationships. Recently, Women's Aid launched a national public awareness campaign highlighting the crime of sexual violence within relationships called Not Happily Ever After. They also released a report on their vision of how we as a society must tackle domestic violence. A major plank of that report calls for 24/7 legal protection for women and children fleeing domestic abuse, as well as demanding that the government sign up to the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention sets down a comprehensive legal framework and approach to tackle domestic violence, particularly against women. It focuses on preventing domestic violence, protecting victims and prosecuting offenders. The Convention categorises violence against women as a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination. The Convention requires states to make it an offence to engage in psychological violence, stalking, physical violence, sexual violence and other abusive acts. The government should look to ratifying this convention as soon as possible. This bill will not stop domestic violence. It won't solve the myriad of problems causing domestic violence, but it is a small improvement in our law. And in doing that, we show that we are on the side of victims and that domestic violence is not something which will be tolerated or accepted or forgiven. Please support this bill.
Thank you.